Hi, I'm Marieke Guy from the Digital Curation Centre. As you can see, I'm not Martin Donnelly, which I'm down in the programme, so slightly different. So I'm here to talk to you today about some work that we've been doing, working towards a practical definition of research data for creative arts institutions. If any of you were in the room earlier today, you would have heard Graham Pryor talk about the institution engagements that we're running at the DCC. And this is a series of sort of face-to-face work with institutions. We're running 18 at the moment. And one of these engagements was with UAL, the University of Arts London. And UAL is one of the largest arts institutions in Europe, and it does creative arts, fashion and design, and a variety of different sort of subject areas. It's actually a collegiate university, so 6 different colleges, and they have different disciplines, but also they have different number of research groups there. So, for example, they have a really interesting research group called Design Against Crime, which looks into cash point machines and how you would design cash point machines. So you can see already that there's sort of elements there that aren't necessarily totally arts focused. So we started working with UAL in 2012. The project that was mentioned earlier by Carlos, Capture, they're involved in that as well, and you'll see that there's some complementary work that's been going on. There's lots of different things that we've been involved with at UAL, but I'm going to focus on the definition of research data, which we've been looking at specifically for the institution and hopefully to be shared within the wider community. The differences between the Capture work and the UAL work they're sort of quite sort of difficult to explain sometimes, but Capture is very much a group work between 4 different partners, whereas our engagement is looking specifically at UAL, bringing staff together from all over UAL. And while Capture is focused very much on the visual arts, so there are lots of things that are excluded. So, for example, performing arts is actually excluded. The UAL engagement looks at all those different disciplines. So it's got a broader focus, but it also has a narrower focus in that we're very keen to look specifically at work that the researchers there are doing and also funded research there. So if we take a step back from that and think about what research data is. This is a Wordle here that I actually created from some of the definitions that we looked at the start of our work, from data.bris, from Monash University, University of Edinburgh, the US government and some other different definitions. But you can see that there's a couple of sort of themes that are coming up there. So, for example, factual is very prominent there in the middle, and then evidence you can see down the side as well, also at the top there, and research. So these are kind of the sort of things that are coming out of definitions of research data. And within the science community, I think there's a lot of consensus there on what research data is. It's this idea that it's evidences outputs, and then it's that which underpins research outputs. So we're looking very much at factual data, statistics, qualitative, but not the stuff that's published in a research output. It can be quite discipline specific, but there's definitely some agreement. And some of this doesn't really work too well with arts institutions. You can already see some of the things that might be causing problems. So we also looked at some of the definitions that were more relevant to us, and for example the Capture project. And in the environmental assessment that Carlos mentioned, they've come up with some sort of ideas around research data in the visual arts. And they saw it as being tangible and intangible. So some of it was very much about tacit knowledge and sort of internalised information. Heterogeneous and infinite and very complex as well. So many different types of research data. So from physical statues and things collected to inspire someone to emotions and lots and lots of different things out there. So it was much more complex than some of the science areas. And also there was this idea that it was the difference between evidence-based and argument-based. A lot of research data in the creative arts is about arguing a point and showing something. So it was very different from some of the science areas. And there was this idea that actually a lot of research data is the process itself, it is part of the process. So we carried out a series of surveys and interviews with the UAL. We worked with UAL to help them do that. And there was actually, I think, 12 5-minute interviews that were done with researchers and something like 17 one-hour-long interviews, and we're still working on the synthesis for those. But they looked at lots of different areas of research data management at UAL, but we also managed to find out some really interesting things about how researchers saw research data itself. So one of the key things that came out straight away is that the term research data doesn't mean anything to researchers in the arts. They just didn't get it. They hadn't heard these talks before, these words before. They saw research data very much as publications or exhibitions. They were confused between the lines between them. But many recognised the importance of research data. For example, at UAL, they actually have the Stanley Kubrick collection there. And it was this idea that research data and that it could possibly be the special collections of the future, the sketchbooks that artists create, and that type of thing is going to be really important. So people recognise that importance. Some of the approaches that we took in the interviews, or the capture interviews themselves, they actually came up with alternate expressions to use instead of the research data. So they said documenting the research process and visualisation and documentation. There was also some ideas around organisational moments when you actually create data, for example, or think about data. Conceptualisation, at that moment you might make some notes, you might make some diagrams, create some videos. We also tried explaining what we felt research data was to see if that had any implications as well. Some other work that we carried out at UAL was working with an actual practitioner in the area, Paul Ryan, who's a lecturer and arts researcher at UAL. He actually wrote a PhD on the whole subject, and he'd come up with some really interesting ideas around symbolic data and iconic data. Symbolic data being very much about sentences and words and expressions, and iconic being very visual and kind of ideas concept. But he came up with this really interesting idea that data is more valid if the position of interpretation is clarified. And this is something we've heard elsewhere. People talk about the idea of context, the position of context. And it was something that came up time and time again. It's really interesting. I do recommend that you have a look at some of Paul's work if you get the chance. We were also involved in a capture workshop, managing the material, tackling visual arts as research data. And this was a really good opportunity for us to talk to research support staff and researchers as well. And we got them to go through some ideas of what they actually saw as research data. So here you can see some listed. So it can be a really broad spectrum, but there's some great ideas there. The workshop brought out lots of issues and observations. For example, there was this idea of provocation. I mentioned factual information being one of the key things about research data. But somebody explained to me that actually within the arts, sometimes people lie. So there was this idea that someone had actually created lots of programs for an event, they'd created marketing materials, they'd done videos, and actually the event had never taken place. So something like that would be scandalous sort of in some scientific communities. It was a completely different idea around these areas. There was also the key point that a lot of work at UAL was interdisciplinary work, and that that it's very difficult to isolate things, and that's why, in a way, we felt maybe a definition needed to be something that could scale across different disciplines. Lots of ideas about whether the arts could learn from scientific approaches, and there's some good papers out there that are worth looking at. But also this idea about research moving towards new knowledge and meaning, and that actually there is a lot that the arts can learn from the sciences, but also that the sciences can learn from the arts. And we also discussed whether definition could just consist solely of examples. I think we decided possibly not, I don't know. So, down the line we came up with our UAL RDM policy, and this is available from the UAL website. It was really, really tricky to come up with some sort of definition for it, but you can see in the second line here it says, generally research data can be considered anything created, captured, or collected as an output of funded research work in its original state. It's a definition to be working with. The key for us was to make sure that researchers, and especially funders researchers, that the policy is actually geared towards, were able to use this to appraise and select the things that they were going to store. It's key for making decisions about what it is you're actually going to keep. So I think we've got lots of lessons through this process. That a definition itself is actually really, really useful for the researchers out there to help them think about what they're doing with their research. There are lots of thoughts around maybe creative arts researchers maybe feel threatened by some of the new scientific approaches, but that maybe things are moving forward in the future, and that hopefully, and I think there's something that we said at the beginning, the idea that maybe science and arts can very much join together as time progresses. This idea of clarifying the position of interpretation and inquiry, and I think that's really important. I think it's not just in the arts fields that clarifying the position is important. I think in the harder sciences, this is actually something that's becoming increasingly important as well. I'm open to discussion about that. The idea that examples themselves are very helpful, that coming up with, pointing researchers in direction, this is what we mean by research data, that can be a really good idea. Thoughts around terminology being tricky as well. For example, it was kind of interesting that whether we just applied scientific terminology or whether we use the arts terminology. And I think, I suppose our approach that we've gone for is actually trying to align the arts more with the sciences. But I think that there's lots more interesting discussion to have, and this is just a first stop, and in the future, and I think maybe at future IDCCs we'll see a lot more on this area.